Welcome to the Underwater Filming Tips series. My name is Vanessa Cara-Kerr, and this is going to be a very short episode. In this episode, we're going to be talking about exposure triangle. It's basically a summary of the last 3 exposure episodes. So let's dive right into it. So what is the exposure triangle? In the past episodes, we talked about shutter speed, aperture, and ISO for underwater filmmaking. And all of these settings affect the brightness, the exposure of your image. But they also all affect the look of your image depending on how you set them. But the one thing they have in common is you cannot change the one without changing the other. And they're all connected together. The important part is that your image is properly exposed. The better your footage is exposed, the less work you will have in post-production. And believe me, it's worth it. Your camera is going to have a little exposure scale on the LCD screen or in your viewfinder, as we talked in the ISO episode, and it will most likely go from -3 or -2 to +2 or +3. And you want to have your exposure set right in the middle at 0. That's when your image is perfectly exposed in most cases. So no matter how you set your ISO, your shutter speed, your exposure, you want to have your exposure at 0. There are going to be situations where your light meter is going to have a hard time because you're going to have a high dynamic range situations where you have very bright parts in the image and very dark parts in the image. And there, you're going to have to decide what part you want to expose to. So do you want to bring down the highlights and expose to the bright part of the image, or do you want to bring up the shadows and expose to the dark part of the image? So one part is going to be over or underexposed. So how does the exposure triangle actually work? To get the proper exposure, you're going to have to change the 3 values depending on what look you're going for. For underwater filmmaking, I usually follow these steps. I will set the camera to my base ISO, to the native ISO, so in this case it's 200. Then I'll set the shutter speed to be double my frame rate, so 1/50, following the 180-degree shutter angle rule. And then I'll set the aperture for the depth of field I want to have. Do I want to have a shallow depth of field, or do I want to have a deeper depth of field? And usually at this point, the image is either overexposed or underexposed. And that's where I will reset my ISO value. So depending if it's under or overexposed, I will bring up or bring down my ISO to get the perfect exposure, to get the exposure scale at 0. ISO is like adding fake light to the image. But be aware that if you increase the ISO too much, you're going to get a noisy image depending on the camera model that you have. But we talked about ISO in the previous episode, so go and check that out if you didn't see it. If I want to have a very shallow depth of field to eliminate the background, I will open up my aperture to a very low f-stop number, like f2.8, and then the image is going to be overexposed because I'm opening up the aperture and letting a lot more light hit the camera sensor. And if the ISO value is already set very high, I can reduce it to get the proper exposure. But if the ISO value is already at its minimum, I have to increase the shutter speed. But that will mean that I'm going to lose the natural looking motion blur. Essentially, this really depends on what I'm okay with. If I want to have that shallow depth of field, then I have to increase my shutter speed. If I want to have a deeper depth of field, so a wider range that is in focus, because I'm filming an underwater landscape or a scene where everything has to be in focus from front to back, I will close down the aperture to a high f-stop number, like f8, f11. But that means that less light hits the sensor, so the image is going to be underexposed. In that case, I'm going to bring up the ISO until my exposure is set back to 0. And as we learned in the shutter speed episode, you don't want to have a slower shutter speed than double your frame rate, because then the image is going to get all blurry and soft and it's just going to look totally unnatural. So just remember, all these settings work together. You cannot change one without changing at least one other. And of course, if you're using video lights, you can use them to increase or decrease the light power to get the proper exposure. But because we're talking about exposure basics, it's important for you to know what the exposure triangle is and how it works before bringing lights into the equation. I definitely recommend trying out all these settings and use the manual mode. Also, use it above water. Get used to your camera, get used to these settings, try to get proper exposure above water before bringing everything underwater, because once you know your camera and all the settings and how everything works, it's going to be a lot easier for you to concentrate on getting the shots underwater rather than how to get the proper exposure. So then you can use all of these tools creatively to get the shots you need to tell a compelling story. And story is key. It's not always about getting the cleanest and the most perfect shot you can get. Sure, it's a great training and you have to train your skills to get clean shots, to get stable shots, to get perfect exposed shots. But at the end of the day, it's how the shot is going to help you tell your story. And story is so important to filmmaking. You're not going to draw your audience in if you have beautiful shots edited together with no story to it. But storytelling is going to be an episode for itself, so stay tuned for that. Just keep in mind, it's not the best quality shot that's going to help you tell your story. It's the actual shot that will help tell your story. So I'd rather have a few shots in there that aren't perfect, but that will help bring your story to life, rather than having great shots that have no story. News channels do this all the time. They use low quality images, low quality smartphone videos, and they do that because through these images, through the videos, it helps them tell the story. If they would just have someone standing there telling the whole story without having any supporting images or videos, the audience is not going to be that interested. And your audience is going to be forgiving if you have shots that aren't perfect, but have a purpose and help tell your story. And everyone learns this sooner or later. Especially if you hand in your films to film festivals or film competitions and you didn't win anything and you wonder why because you've got perfect shots. Well, have a look at the winners. Check out the ones that won first, second and third prize. Usually these are films that have really compelling stories that draw the audience in rather than just having a beautiful edit with nice images. But of course all of this doesn't mean that you shouldn't get good quality shots. Of course you should try to get the best shots that's possible. And with training and experience, you're going to get better and better with each dive. Learn as much as you can, try out as much as you can, go out and film as much as you can. If you have a lake nearby or if you have the ocean nearby, if you're one of the lucky ones, just dive and film. Don't stress out too much about quality. And if there is a situation where you mess up the shot, get it anyway if it does help to tell your story. So essentially what I'm trying to say here is train and learn as much as you can. And now it's quick tip time. There's a webpage called DOF Simulator, DOF standing for depth of field. So it's a webpage that simulates the depth of field. This should have been part of the aperture episode, but I just didn't think about it, so here it is. And this is a fantastic website. I really love recommending it because you can try it out yourself even without a camera. You just need a computer or a smartphone. You can instantly try out different f-stops and see how the depth of field changes in your image. You can choose the model, you can choose the surroundings, you can choose the focal length. You can even choose the camera sensor and even the camera model to try out everything. I really love this page. It helps you understand how depth of field works and how it looks like. You can try out all the different settings. This is not really for exposure, it's just to see how depth of field works. I'll leave a link in the description below, go and check them out, it's a really good webpage. And note this is not sponsored by them, I just think it's a very educational page and I like recommending it. I hope the short little video was helpful to you. If you did, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and if you have any questions, leave a comment below. Safe diving and I will hopefully see you in the next episode. Welcome to the Underwater Filming Tips series. My name is Vanessa Cara-Kerr. I don't really know how to say what I'm thinking. And let's dive right into it.